Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 32, two-color brioche knit scarf. I made two versions and both were made using the 36-inch long US size equivalent to a US 15 needle. So if you bought it from me, it is the orange one, or if you made it yourself with polyethylene tubing, get the 3/8" tubing and look at my previous videos and you'll see how to make your own knitting hoops easily and inexpensively. So I made this scarf in two versions. The original, in case you're transposing patterns, the original pattern called for a US 11 needle using the Paton's Classic Bulky Wool, which is a 5 weight. And that's what this was made with. Now, mine is a little looser because I didn't use a US 11. I used the size equivalent to a US 15. And I think it still came out very nicely because you can still see the pattern definition. Now, I made it shorter. I put on fewer stitches because, well, it actually came out a little longer than the original pattern. But if you do that and you use a pattern that's meant for smaller needles, you'll probably need to put on fewer stitches. So this is a little looser than it would have turned out, as I was saying. And I want to caution you about one thing in making this scarf. There's a considerable stretch to this. And if I hold this up right here, you'll see that, in fact, let me move the table over just a little bit. You'll see that there is more stretch on one side of the scarf. This is where I cast on, and this is where I cast off. I cast on here too loosely, so you want to be careful of that and try to get these as even as you can. Once the scarf is on, it won't be as noticeable. But it is reversible, as you see, and that's the beauty of a brioche. And then when you twist it like the one I'm wearing, you'll see both sides. So this was made by putting on 104 stitches and using 1.5 balls of each color. And the finished size is 60 inches around and 8.5 inches wide. And the one I'm wearing and the one on the table is about 6.5 inches wide, finished size, or wide, and about 54 inches around for the red and green, and this one turned out to be about 52, just because I knit it a little bit tighter. And this blue yarn was a little shorter than the package stated. It's supposed to be 81-yard skeins. Both of these were made with Hometown USA, and I worked the pattern so that you would only need one ball of each color. So, but this blue yarn was a little bit shorter, so this is 25 rows, this is 27, the red and green, and I used 80 stitches. Now, they'll be stretched out quite a bit along your hoop when you put the 80 stitches on, but your first round is an increasing round, so make sure that your knitting hoop will accommodate the number of stitches you want to use. So, I also tried something different this time when I started the first round, and it was a little trick I'd seen about circular knitting, and they took the first two stitches and they crossed them. I had mixed results, and I'm going to show it to you in the demonstration, but I thought on the one I'm wearing and the red and green one, that's this portion right here. This is where I crossed the stitches for to begin the first round. And you can see that doesn't look as nice as where I created stitch by looping my end of my tail when I was finished knitting to create a stitch to close that gap. It came out better on the gray scarf, and of course now I have to find it again because I picked this up. But so, you know, how bad does it look if I can't find it? That's kind of the point. So when you're working something, here it is right here. So you see there's a little bit of a lump there, and the gap is a little bit wider where I crossed the stitches to begin my first round. And you can see I probably should have pulled that up a little bit tighter. And that may be easier to do on knitting needles. But what I don't like about it is it tends to pull the design to the side. And that's more noticeable than the gap, if you know what I mean. I'll show you how to do it anyway. So we're going to move the camera and we'll get started. So for our demonstration, I'm going to use a little mini hoop, and I've already put on 18 stitches. You can make your brioche scarf with any number of stitches, but you need to do multiples of 2 when you cast on. So just for our demonstration, I've put on 18 stitches, and I used the slingshot cast on as I showed you in other videos with a little mini hoop here, and that was just like this. Now, when I do that, that leaves my tail and working yarn on my left. And if you want to start the scarf, as I've showed you with other circular videos, just move your stitches so that the ridge is to the inside, and that way it helps you keep track so you don't twist your stitches. And you want to turn it so that your working yarn is on the right hand side. And you can take this and just loop this around to the back and take off your first stitch from the left and begin knitting. And that's how you would make your first stitch. Now, if you want to try what I did on the scarves I made and you want to cross your first stitches, which I've seen in other, this is for circular knitting needles, of course, what you would do is once you've got your stitches on there and you've turned your ridge to the inside, then put your hoop, if you're using the big one, obviously it's going to be on your lap or between your knees. So you want to put it so that your working yarn now is on the left, not the right. And you are going to take off the first stitch and hold it in your hand. And you will take off the first stitch from the right and put it over to the left. Now, if you want to, put your finger through that stitch, you don't lose it. And you might have to squeeze your hoop a little bit. Now, take your original stitch that came from this side, this is your working yarn. Make sure the working yarn is coming off to the front like this, and place it on to the right side of the hoop and snug that up. Now, it could be that my edge doesn't look quite as good as it would on knitting needles because these points, especially on this little round thing, are not that close together, but they are on this. Once you've squeezed that between your knees, you know, that matches up pretty well. So that's neither here nor there. So that is how you begin if you want to do a crossed stitch to start. Now, to begin this, you're going to need obviously 2 skeins of yarn in contrasting color, and one skein, in this case, is gold, and that's going to be called our A yarn. And then you'll need a second skein of another color, which will be your B yarn. And this pattern begins with a first round, and you only do this one time, and it's your foundation round, and it's an increasing round. So in this case, I start with 18 stitches, but I'll wind up with 27. And the sequence for this round, so go ahead and click your clicker if you want. This is the first round. So the sequence is knit 1, yarn over, slip 1. And you repeat that 3-stitch sequence till you're all the way around. So first of all, now that you have your stitches crossed, take your stitch marker and mark that this is the beginning of round 1. Now these are going to be a little tricky because these are fairly tight. This is your cast on row. And again, I caution you not to make your cast on row too loose. Now, you would if you were making a throw, but in this case, it didn't turn out that well to do it that way. So remove your first stitch. The first stitch is a knit 1, and because these stitches are so small, you might want to take your yarn, lay it over your index finger. Again, make sure you have your working yarn. Place it over the yarn, the stitch, and push your index finger and the yarn up through the opening of the stitch. Pull the working yarn through. It should look just like this. The working yarn then is coming from around the pipe, coming up through the old stitch into your fingers, and coming off to the left. And you're going to lay it, if you will, face down on the right. The next thing you do is a yarn over. And all you need to do is take your yarn through the tips clockwise, hold it in your hand. Now you slip the next stitch, which means move the stitch from the left to the right, face down, without knitting it or purling it, without front stitching or back stitching it. Next, knit 1 again. You notice, by the way, And again, these are small. You're going to have to kind of work your finger up through there. When I have the yarn over, keep it below that stitch I just slipped. And now grab the yarn, pipe it, yarn over, slip one. You might have to pull a little bit or even squeeze, depending on how you've made your knitting hoop. Of course, the bigger ones are easier to manipulate. Next, if you've lost where you're at, you can see, well, here comes my working yarn. It's actually coming around below this stitch. So I know this was my slip stitch. That was my yarn over. What I need to do is knit one next. And again, just lay the working yarn over your index finger, place the stitch over it, pull the working yarn through, lay it face down, yarn over, hold it, and again, do not pull this too loosely or pull it too tightly. When you have it here in your hand and you have it wrapped around the pipe, it should look like your other stitches. It shouldn't be any tighter or any looser. So I wouldn't do this as your first project. I would do something simpler till you get used to just how firmly you need to pull your yarn or hold on to it. And this is how it's going to be looking. So as you begin this increasing round, you have your knit stitch, then you have your yarn over is crossing over the stitch you slipped. Knit one, here was your yarn over, and it'll look like a little cross over the stitch you slipped. So continue around, and I'll show you how to begin round two. So I've knit nearly all the way around for round one, and one stitch remains on the left hand side. And the last thing I need to do, you can see that this was a stitch I knit. The yarn is coming through, the working yarn that is coming through the old stitch. And the last thing I need to do is one more yarn over and slip one. And that completes round one. Now, you'll notice that now my working yarn is hanging loose, and that's okay. And remember, that does count as a stitch. So if this is fallen behind and you count your stitches and you say, uh-oh, I only have 26 stitches on there. You don't. You have 27. This counts as that. And you're just going to let this hang freely because now you're going to begin round two. So you've moved your stitch marker back to the right, clicker, clicker for round two, and pick up your contrasting ball of yarn. Now I would say, leave about 10-12 inches here and just lay it between the tips of your knitting hoop. And the first thing you do for round two is a yarn over. And the sequence for round two is yarn over, slip one, then you're going to backstitch two together. So on these rounds, the rest of the whole body of this is an alternation between round 2 and 3. And every time you knit two together or purl two together, you will be knitting together the slipped stitch and the yarn over, just as a reference point. So this one begins with a yarn over, which we'll just do by, again, put your yarn between here, let it hang loose, don't worry about tying this in, and bring it around to the front. Hold it there, but don't pull on it because this is just loose here. So make sure it doesn't pull through. And the first thing you do, besides this next thing you do, is slip one. So take the stitch off from the left and put it, if you will, face down on the right. Now, continue your working yarn to the back or above, however you want to look at it. Now you're going to back stitch two together, or as I often say, purl two together. So it doesn't matter however you want to look at it. The two you're going to be purling together is that crossed stitch. It's the slipped stitch and the yarn over. And that yarn over is going to look a little strange. It's not really. In fact, let me drop this working yarn. You can see that the yarn over is just kind of an upside down U. It's right here in my right hand. But once you knit the stitch, it creates it. So this is, you're going through two strands. So if you want to, the working yarn is across your index finger, and now just use your index finger. I kind of hold my index finger out here a bit. That way when I put the index finger behind the stitches, it creates a little slack that allows it a little bit easier to pull the working yarn through. Now see, this yarn separates a little bit, so be careful of that. I've used this over and over again, so it's really worn out. But notice now, because I did that, I didn't pull the yarn coming around here. You don't want to tighten this while you're trying to pull the working yarn through. And it should look just like this. Now lay it face down. So that was your back stitch or purl 2 together. Now you need to begin the sequence again. So just continue your yarn clockwise, slip 1, move your stitches around. When you pick this yarn back up again, make sure that it's staying below that slip stitch. It should ride right there. And now bring the yarn to the back, take off 2, it'll be the X of the stitches, it'll be the yarn over and the slip stitch, and back stitch those together. It should look like that. Lay it face down. Make sure that you don't pull too tightly when you're yarn overing clockwise. It's always a clockwise movement, so it just continues around. Hold it in the front. I just have it loosely held between my 2 fingers here while I slip off the next stitch. Bring your yarn to the back. If you're working with multiple strands and a bigger hoop, you're going to want to make sure that you kind of keep a hold of these yarns all the time. It's easy to drop one, so it's easier if you keep a hold of them in your hand. Now let me show you what's happening. So this is your round 2, and you can see I've added in my green yarn. So now for every gold stitch I have 2 green ones. So continue around and I'll show you what to do at the end of round 2. So I've knit around to just almost the end here. The last stitch I made was a back stitch 2 together. So I need to yarn over, slip 1, and now take your yarn to the back, and this is my last back stitch 2 together. And you're going to say, oh, but I only have 1 stitch. You don't. You have your working yarn from A, which by now has probably moved to the back, and just bring it forward. So it's going to be hanging loose. This is your working yarn of A from the first row. So now take your working yarn for your round B, and you're going to back stitch these 2. And really, you know, this isn't a stitch at all. This was just the yarn over. But it will be as soon as you create it. So now it looks like this. Pipe that, and just leave this hang. Bring your working yarn B back to the front. Move your stitch marker to the right, and now you can start round 3. Now, so round 3 begins with a knit 2 together. So you want to pick up your A yarn. Every time you knit round 2, you'll be using your B yarn, and every time you knit a round 3, which will be your odd numbers as you click your clicker if you want to keep track, will be your yarn A. So all you have to do now is pick up the first 2 stitches. And that is going to look funny at the beginning of this round, because remember, this is just your tail when you brought the yarn through. But that's okay. You're going to take it off just like that. It's going to look like this. It's the yarn over, and that's why that was the tail when we first started. And then just lay that over your working yarn to front stitch 2 together. Pull that through, so you'll have a green stitch and a gold stitch, and pipe it. Now you yarn over. So now we bring the yarn back through the middle, around clockwise, slip 1, and the next thing we do is knit 2 together. So we start the sequence over, and you'll see it this time there'll be a green loop. That's the yarn over. See how it's just a loop that hasn't really, it was just the yarn over there, and a gold one. So take that off, front stitch 2 together, pull it through. It'll look just like that, and you'll see the gold yarn, the working yarn, coming around and almost crossing the green. That's the slip yarn over, and this is the slip stitch, the green one. And then just pipe it yarn over. Make sure that when you do that and pull the yarn back through, that these don't flip back up onto your pipe. And pull that around to the front, slip one. Now, this should come off easily. If it does not, because these yarn overs are looser and they're not linked at the bottom, they're just looped over the top of the pipe, sometimes this will have crossed over this. In other words, your yarn over, as you push your things, especially if you do like I do and try to cram all your knitting over to the left so you don't have to stop as often, sometimes this yarn over will have gotten looped up over this one. And when you go to knit that, or when you go to take that stitch off, it won't go. When you try to take that slip stitch off, it won't go. So just check and make sure that you actually have the correct one and not your yarn over. Slip one. Again, your yarn over is always going to be below your slip stitch on the right hand side. And now take two off. This is your knit two together. Again, you're going to have a yarn over in the stitch you slipped last time. And just put it over the working yarn and pull it through and put it face down. Remember, we're working in the round. So if you think of this as the face of the stitch, what you can see, the top portion, it has to go face down when it goes to the opposing pipe. Unlike when we do the stationary rods. Let's do that one more time. It's just a yarn over, slip one, and knit two together. Okay, so continue around, and I'll show you what to do when we get to the end of the row. So I've nearly completed round 3. I just have my last sequence set to do, and you can see that I have knit 2 together, and now I yarn over by bringing the yarn through in clockwise and slip 1. And this completes round 3. And you can see that when I stop, again, my working yarn from A is just going to be hanging freely, if you will, below that slip stitch that I did last, and I'll begin another round 2. So now click your clicker. It will say 4, but I know that's an even number. That just helps keep me track of the rows. I didn't have as much of that blue yarn as I said when I made the other scarf, so that was 25 rows. You want to keep track. On that scarf, you will need about 15 feet of yarn per row, and you will need 30 feet of the alternating color. In this case, it would be green. I would need 30 feet to do my last round and my cast-off row if I had 80 stitches on. So let's begin round 2 again, just as we did before. So just let your A yarn drop, pick up your green yarn, your yarn B, and make sure it's your working yarn, not your tail. And the first thing you do is a yarn over. So you see I've put my stitch marker onto the right, so make sure that your yarn over is above the stitch marker. Slip 1. This is your tail. You could just let that hang, or if you want to at some point you can push it to the back. But go ahead now and bring your yarn between the tips to the back so that it's in position to back stitch 2 together. And you'll notice that's, again, a green and gold. Bring the stitch, the working yarn through to make your new stitch, and lay it face down on the right hand side. Now your yarn is at the back, just leave it there and continue around to the front. Again, don't pull this too tightly. It should look exactly like your other stitches. And slip stitch 1, slip 1, then bring your yarn to the back so that it's in position to back stitch 2 together. And off they come. Put your yarn over your index finger, push it through, pull the working yarn up, pipe it. You can leave your yarn at the back, continue around for your yarn over, slip 1, bring your yarn through into the back, take off 2, back stitch 2 together. Now, let me show you something. This portion, we used this was round 3. So you see we have 2 gold stitches for every green. Now, since we're beginning another round 2, we have 2 green stitches for every gold. It's suggested, I've seen on videos, when you're knitting this way, it's helpful to stop don't stop and start at the beginning or ending of a row. That it's easier to know where you're at if you simply stop in the middle of the row. Then you know, well, this is my working yarn. Even though this is a, obvious visual cue, but just to help you keep track. And if you want to, as you're knitting and you've come to the end of a row, or you're going to stop, you're going to put your knitting down whether you're at the end of the row or not. If you'll take and just put a rubber band at the end of that will help keep your stitches from falling off. So I've knit around on this round 2. This is our 4th row, but I've knit around to the end of round 2, and we have our last sequence, so my yarn is already at the back, and I just yarn forward and slip 1 and bring the yarn to the rear, and again it will look like you only have 1 stitch on. So every time you are at the end of round 2, you will need to, it'll look just like this. Let me tip this forward a little bit. Here's the working yarn from A coming out from underneath that stitch. Just bring it back to the front. If you've lost sight of it or don't know where it's at, that'll just be hanging loose. And when you have your yarn B then at the back of your piece, between your rod tips, when you take this off, it will create a loop that you will back stitch 2 together and pull it through so that it looks like this. You can pipe it. Notice that this is the yarn A. Just pull it back down and bring this yarn back forward. So we'll do one more round of round 3, and then I'll show you the decreasing row and the cast off. So now we're going to begin another round 3. Click your clicker. This is your 5th row. And that's another reference point for you, odd number, so you know you're doing a round 3. And move your stitch marker to the right hand side to begin. Pick up yarn A, and the first thing you do is knit 2 together. And again, those will be your crossed stitches, your yarn over. And notice that this whole entire row, we have 2 green stitches for every gold, so I know that that last round was done with yarn B. So all I need to do now is begin my sequence as a knit 2 together. It'll look like this. Pipe it like that. Yarn over, hold it loosely, slip 1, knit 2 together. If it helps, put your fingers through them before you put them over the working yarn and pull it through, pipe it, yarn over, slip 1, and knit 2 together. Continue around, and I'll show you what to do next. So I've reached nearly the end of round 3, and all I need left to do is to continue my yarn over and slip my stitch. Now, no matter how wide you're making your scarf, your last knitted row is round 3. And you will just let this yarn hang. You could cut it at this point, but I just usually leave it attached. And go ahead now, and you can move your stitch marker to the right. And now you're going to begin a decreasing row. And you will use yarn B for this. So if you're doing the scarf, as I said earlier, as I was wearing at the beginning of the video, you will need about 15 feet for each of these rows. So that's for the decreasing row and the cast off. So keep track of how much yarn you have. Your decreasing round is a knit 1, leave the yarn to the front. Don't wrap it around. In other words, we're not doing a yarn over on this. So now you purl 2 together. So take your yarn from front to back without wrapping it around. We're decreasing on this row, and we're going to go back to our original stitch count. So back stitch, 2 together, pipe that, just bring your yarn to the front, don't wrap it around. Knit 1, pipe it, take your yarn to the back, purl those 2 together, bring your yarn to the front, move your stitches around, knit 1, and that sequence continues until you are all the way to the end. And we'll just keep going. So I know that if you say, oh, where was I? Well, see, I have 2 stitches on there. There's a gold and a green, so I know I need to knit this one. Take your yarn to the back. You can also tell, because there was my X of stitches, so I know I need to back stitch those together. Keep moving them around your hoop. When you're working on a big hoop, you may need to move them section by section, like so, because that's a lot of mass to push over. It's not that they should be tight, and they shouldn't. So this one's existing by itself up there. That's another clue that tells you that that one needs to be front stitched. This is my yarn over my stitch I slipped, so I need to purl those together. I think it's time to get some new yarn for my demonstrations. Now be careful when you're doing this that you don't catch one of the loops that are below this. Make sure you're only going through those 2 stitches. And make sure you grab all the plies. If your plies have separated like this has, which will happen often in acrylic yarn, you want to make sure you have all of them. We're almost done with our decreasing row here. And again, make sure you have all those plies. Sorry, my little hoop thing's wiggling around in here. It's probably making you seasick. All right.
No, it's the camera movement.
No, it's me. Look at. Don't listen to him. We have a new stand set up that doesn't creak. Listen, there's no noise. Now look, here I am. I'm back to that last one again. Here's Mr. Yarn A. So make sure that he's to the front for that last purl 2 together, just like that. And bring your yarn to the front. And now, all of your stitches that are remaining on your hoop should be green stitches. Should look just like that. Now you're ready to cast off. And all you need to do is, I would keep your stitch marker on there. Go ahead and put it over here. Forget about yarn A. Pick up your yarn B. And you will front stitch this. And you will put it on your pipe. And you will make a second one. So now you have 2 stitches and you need to take one off. If you want to make sure that these are loose, and I should have done this, you can always just loosen these up on the pipe this way. And take your first stitch that you made and take it over the second. Make another stitch by front stitching. This is casting off, called casting off knitwise. There it is. Make sure it's good and loose. Take off the first. Bring it over the second. So you have 2 loose stitches. Bring it over. As you work around, there'll be a gap that widens up here, and that's just fine. So continue around in that manner, and I'll show you what to do at the end. Alright, so I've worked my way around. I have 1 more stitch remaining on my hoop. And you can go ahead and, give yourself 10 inches or so of yarn and cut it. And go ahead and take this off. And holding that loop in your fingers now, bring the yarn through that loop. And give a good tug on that. Now, here's the end of your Now, you can see where we cast on and put those two together is there, and you'll have to weave those ends in. Where you ended just now, you see that step. And that's what we're going to close up with that little trick. So, what you want to do, if you can make all that out. So, I showed this on another video, and I don't always do this right. Sometimes it takes me a couple of attempts. But what you're looking for to create that false stitch, if you will, that will draw that up, is you want to look for your line of V's. That doesn't mean this. Notice how that almost looked like chain links. What you want is actually this, and it might be on the edge. So what you want to do after you have your tail, and you know, I probably didn't need to put that in a knot. I think there's another way of doing that that doesn't create a knot. You know how I always pull my yarn through there. But get your needle now and your tail. And what you want to do is look at this top row of V's. You don't want to use your line of stitching. You literally want your last two V's. And sometimes it's hard to find. And sometimes I have to play around with this a little bit till I decide where those V's actually are. And if you do it the first time, see how I'm going to kind of pull this around a little bit. And I'm going to go in, not here with this loop, but right here with this. And you want to take your tail now, so it's from where you ended. It's the very first one you cast off. So you want to go under both sides of those V's, and only the V itself, if you can see what I'm doing here. And if it doesn't look right the first time you do it, you know, don't knot it all in till you see how that works. So go under both sides of the V, like so. Normally you would work front to back, but there is no front or back on this. Then take your needle with your yarn and go back into the middle of the V on the other side. So go right in here. And because I did that little knot, made that little knot when I pulled my yarn through, and it got a little bulky there. So if it doesn't look right the first time you do it, try again. Because see how that knot is kind of bulked up there. But essentially you're going to wind up with something that looks like that. And again, that little knot is kind of giving me a hard time. But once you've pulled that through and pulled up, it should basically, and woven this in obviously, you're going to go inside. Let me just tuck this in to pretend that I knotted this in. And you'll virtually have something that doesn't show. Now, some people take this through and they literally weave their tail into the ply. A few stitches in and a few stitches back. I'm finding that doesn't work for this acrylic yarn, but it works okay for wool. So you'll probably have to take this in and make a little knot to literally hold it in. And then you're done, and it should look exactly like this, with one side of gold being prominent and the other side being green. Be sure to check the body of all my information. It'll give you the patterns. Thanks for watching.